we have co-presenting Leanne Correll with Sunagri LLC. Leanne has a passion for agriculture and the natural resources on which we depend that began early as she grew up on an eastern Wyoming ranch, homesteaded by her grandfather. She has devoted her life to working directly or indirectly with the industry. Leanne is currently the president and owner of Sunagri LLC, an agriculture and natural resources consulting business with the mission of working together today for a brighter tomorrow. The focus of the business is to work with a variety of partners to address natural resources challenges for agriculture producers. She assists ranchers in working with agencies to work through the minutia of we can't and get to how we can, to develop solutions to issues. She works with ranchers, federal, state, and local governments, and the Wyoming Stock Growers Association across a broad spectrum of topics. Her passion has also led her to volunteer her time on projects if she believes it a benefit to agriculture. In addition, she has expertise and experience in areas of education, natural resources, livestock, National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, collaboration, government planning, and project management. Pauline Hope with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services out of the Ecological Services Field Office in Buffalo, Wyoming. Pauline has been a wildlife biologist in Wyoming for 15 years. Currently, she is the boots-on-the-ground biologist for Fish and Wildlife Service Wyoming Field Office, focused on the implementation of the statewide Sage Grouse Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances for Wyoming ranch management. Please join me in welcoming Pauline and Leanne.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thanks for everybody for being here this afternoon. I know it's kind of at the end of the day, and you know, we're all kind of overloaded with all of the good information that we've been receiving, but we're really excited to share an experience and some on-the-ground successes with you that we've done through partnerships and collaborative processes. And, you know, there's many places that, you know, if you hear somebody that says, well, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help you, that's when you take a big step back. But I will tell you the partnership that the Wyoming private landowners have had with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and particularly with Pauline, has just been really a positive experience, and we're getting some things done on the ground for the benefit of sage grouse. But what we're going to talk about, first of all, goes well beyond sage grouse and is a program, a policy program with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances, that it can be used nationwide. So first of all, I want to poll and find out how many have heard about the Candidate Conservation Agreement with assurances program. Okay, quite a few of you. That's a good thing. So, you know, it's not a real well-known program, so I'm glad to see that you have that knowledge. So anyway, with that, Pauline's going to start out and give us kind of some of the background and the basic information as far as the CCAAs. You know, we talk in alphabet soup a lot of times. So she's going to talk about that and give you kind of some of the background before we go into some of the success stories we've had with the specific one for the sage grouse in Wyoming.
Okay, so most of you said that you have heard of CCAAs and some of you have not, so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what a CCAA is. It's a formal agreement between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and one or more parties, a non-federal landowner typically. It addresses the conservation needs of proposed or candidate species or species likely to become candidates before they become listed as endangered or threatened. It's a voluntary tool, voluntary agreement, in which the landowners commit to conservation actions that will help stabilize or restore the species with the goal that listing will become unnecessary. So it's a risk management tool for the landowner, essentially. So the purpose of the agreement is to encourage conservation actions of the species described in a CCAA. And of course, as I said, the need is to preclude the need for listing as threatened or endangered. So what are the benefits to landowners? if several landowners sign up, a good majority of the habitat area of the species that is covered under CCAA, if they all sign up and the actions preclude listing, then the landowner is not regulated by the Endangered Species Act. If the species is listed anyway, then the landowner is actually given an incidental take permit. What this means is if the species becomes listed, they can continue their ranching operations, for example, and if they happen to run over the species listed under the CCAA, they're covered under that permit for any death of an endangered or threatened species. They also get assurances from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and this is the big thing. This means that anything they agreed to in their CCAA, those are the only things that they will have to do and they can continue doing if that species is listed. The Fish and Wildlife Service won't ask them to do anything more than they're already doing. So that's a big assurance and a big plus for the CCAA. In addition, landowners who want to go above and beyond the CCAA are often have potential federal or state cost share programs for other projects, and I'll get a little further into that in a little bit as well. As I said, it's a voluntary program, can be canceled at any time, so that is a huge plus for this. It's also very flexible, so it's developed with the landowner in mind, and it fits the needs and the unique issues and opportunities associated with that land. It also allows landowners to work with local partners and people who they already have relationships with in their area. So they don't have to work directly with the Fish and Wildlife Service necessarily. And it's also compatible with other programs. You've heard of, well, you may not have heard of the Sage Grouse Initiative, SGI, NRCS EQIP programs. They all work together. So as Leanne talked about, in Wyoming, we created a Wyoming Sage Grouse CCAA, which covers the entire state of Wyoming. Ranchers in the state knew that they were already doing good things that do benefit sage grouse. So they actually came to us and they knew about this CCAA tool that we have in our bank here. And they said, we want you to create this agreement for us. We want the assurances in case sage grouse are listed. So we ended up creating an umbrella CCAA that covers the entire state of Wyoming. And the purpose of this umbrella is to make it super easy for landowners to sign up underneath it. Really an easy, streamlined process. If a landowner signs up, they're covered for up to 20 years and renewable for another 20 years for a total of 40 years under this agreement. So the goals of the Wyoming statewide CCAA, as I just said, are to streamline the process for landowners, make it very easy for them to sign up for the agreement. Number 2, to promote conservation measures to benefit sage grouse. And 3, to provide those assurances to the landowners in the case if the sage grouse were listed under the Endangered Species Act. So there has been a lot of activity going on with sage grouse, lots of petitioning for listing, and this is what caused this initial reaction of landowners in the state. And in 2015, it was determined that they were not warranted to be listed. They listed, the Fish and Wildlife Service listed 5 factors why it was not listed under the ESA. And number 3 here, it has to do with these voluntary multi-partner private lands efforts, and under which the CCAA is one of them. So all of the landowners who did sign up for these kind of programs, including SGI and other NRCS programs, collectively helped to not list the sage grouse. Additionally, the Fish and Wildlife Service worked with the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service to create complementary agreements called a CCA. So instead of a CCAA, they're candidate conservation agreements. These, like the CCAA, they're in agreement with the landowner or the permittee and the Fish and Wildlife Service, but also the other federal agency, and they apply to federal lands. So these complement the CCAA. We have several participants who also signed up for the CCAs. And here's a map of the state and who has enrolled so far in the state of Wyoming. We currently have 37 ranches that have enrolled, and those are the, I guess, tannish orange spots on the state. Just under 500,000 acres enrolled in the program. The gold areas are the BLM CCAs, and we have just under 900,000 acres enrolled in that program, and 22 of those 37 participants signed up also for the CCA on BLM lands. And the purpose in Wyoming, especially, a lot of the lands are intermingled, so in the same pastures you're going to have BLM and private lands, so it makes sense to sign up for both programs.
Okay, with that, one of the key things that, the ranchers went to the Fish and Wildlife Service and were asking for this program. But if it wasn't for the many partners and the collaborative process that went on in order to develop this, it would have never come to fruition. Because there are many stakeholders when you're talking about these agreements, and particularly over the whole state of Wyoming. So what I have on here are the ones that were involved and actually had their names on that CCAA agreement. On the left-hand side there, you'll see that, they were involved, and then it had the signature. And the Fish and Wildlife Director for the Wyoming Ecological Services Office had to actually sign off on that. It goes through the NEPA process and had to be noticed in the Federal Register. So all of these partners coming together, as well as many individuals and individual NGO organizations, were all a part of getting that to come to fruition over several years. It was a very painstaking, tasking process to come up with an agreement that was good for the ranchers, as well as then worked for within the policies and regulatory assurances of the Fish and Wildlife Service. So once we had that agreement in place, the number one reason that landowners don't sign up for different programs that are available, whether it be through NRCS or through Fish and Wildlife and various things, is because they don't have the educational information, have all of the facts available to make an informed decision. So with that, it came out, and now we have this agreement. Now how do we go about letting people know what it is, all the ins and outs of it? And so one of the things that the Wyoming Stock Growers Association took on as a project was, one of their mottos is, "We inform, you decide." And there's a quote from Jim Magagna here that says, "While the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has determined that livestock grazing is not a significant threat to the species, a listing could have major impacts on our ability to manage private and state agricultural lands and utilize our federal grazing permits." So they went out and got grant funding through the National Fish and Wildlife Federation or Foundation, and then also the Wyoming NRCS office, in order to do an outreach and education program. And that's where I came in. They hired me to help do and to oversee and facilitate that outreach and education program, and that's part of what I do with my business, is I take on these individual projects and then make them come to fruition and bring the partners together to do that. So we also had other partners for the project that I have listed there as well. Well, the interesting thing was, here we had this signed document. It had gone through the NEPA process and everything else, but when we get to implementation and working cooperatively between all of these different partners that had put it together, we needed to have a common understanding of what that document actually meant and how we were going to actually implement it. And that was the interesting thing. Not only did I have to do outreach and education for the landowners to be able to tell them what they were signing up for, or what, you know, they had decisions to make into signing up for, we had to get the partners together and go, okay, now it's implementation time. Let's come up with some templates that the Fish and Wildlife were very instrumental in helping us put together for the conservation plan requirements, monitoring plan requirements, and the annual reporting. And every one of those different agencies and entities had a little bit different idea, but I had to also bring them to the table and say, okay, it's very crucial that we present this to the landowners correctly. So we really worked through that process. So in doing that, what we ended up doing is we ended up creating a whole series of documents and things that were in writing that we could show to the producers and the landowners and say, this is what the answers are to these questions. We had question and answer documents that you saw flash up there. We had legal interpretation from a legal entity that from a legal perspective of what we could do, and all of that was put into packets of information, which over here on this table to your right in front, there are some packets if anybody is interested in looking at those. And then also on that table there are some of the individual pamphlets and flyers, but there's a handout that we made for today that has links to all those resources so that you could go to them afterwards. And even though it may not be applicable for your operation, because you may not have sage grouse, there may be another species that would be interested in this. This final one that's up here, the cover of it, I also then in the process worked with the University of Wyoming, ended up getting my master's degree. My major professor is sitting back here, Dr. Derek Skasta, who will be speaking to you later today, but worked on putting together a landowner guide for sage grouse conservation in Wyoming. This is a publication that's available through Extension, and it's a very nice publication meant to throw on the producer's dash and whatever to help navigate through some of the latest research and things that were going on that is just a valuable tool for them to use on an everyday basis. What we did in the process of this education and outreach program is we really looked at where those gaps were, and this was a gap. There were other guides like this around the western United States, but Wyoming didn't have anything like it. So here are the resource links. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service resource link takes you to all the CCAA and CCA information from a policy and regulatory perspective. The Wyoming Stock Growers Association, every one of these documents that we put together and all of the information on the Wyoming one is available on that website. And then the University of Wyoming Extension Sage Grouse Conservation page has a link to where you can download that full document online, or you can order the document if you want a hard copy of it. It also has a lot of other links to videos and other publications that have to do with sage grouse all throughout the West. Well, in the process of doing this, as you work on these partnership deals, you run into those individual ranchers who want to go way above and beyond. And so what we found is that working with the ranchers, telling their story and telling what they do, as we've heard many of the presentations here today and yesterday, they're very passionate about taking care of their land, making it better for the next generations, including livestock with wildlife and doing it for the benefits of wildlife. So some of those things, one of the benefits and really things that I've gotten out of this is I've created a very good working relationship, but also friends relationship with a ranch that is really going way above and beyond. The additional monitoring that is done is above and beyond what is required for a CCAA, but they want to do the right thing for their land and for future generations. So there's extensive planning efforts, and way more monitoring is being done on private lands than what was being done before.
So finally, we just want to tell you a few of the good things that we're seeing as far as implementation goes with the CCAA in Wyoming. We've been implementing for about 2 to 3 years for most of the ranches. And I have to say that most of the ranches are already doing amazing things for sage grouse, and they already were. More than half of them are also involved with other programs, such as the NRCS SGI program and the CSP. So like I said earlier, those programs really integrate well together. There are 18 threats listed in the CCAA to sage grouse. Under that, there's conservation measures that are available for the landowners to choose from that could reduce or minimize impacts to habitat or sage grouse. The one conservation measure that is not optional throughout this is that they must maintain contiguous habitat by avoiding fragmentation. So all of the other threats and conservation measures are optional and dependent on impacts or issues associated with the land or opportunities. So this is the one that's not optional. And of course, all of the landowners are following this one. All of them are maintaining the contiguous habitat. Several have already put their ranches into conservation easements, and 2 more in the last 3 years are working on conservation easements. Another conservation measure is to convert electrically powered pumps or windmills to solar. During this time, 7 pumps were converted to solar, 1 new solar tank was installed, and 2 windmills were removed. Buried new and existing power lines. 4 ranches buried new lines, 2 buried existing overhead power lines, and 1 continued to work with a whole mess of oil and gas companies that have overhead power lines on their property, and they're working to bury those. Another conservation measure to work with weed and pest districts to identify invasive species and work to control them. 75% are already working with their districts. The other 25% either are doing it with a consultant or they don't really have that issue on their land, so it's not applicable. A requirement is that the landowners must develop a written conservation plan and grazing management plan as part of the CCAA. As I stated, the majority, actually, I don't know, 70% of the participants are also part of an NRCS program. So they already have a grazing management plan, and we simply roll that into the CCAA. We don't ask them to change anything that they're already doing. And they're working to develop a conservation plan, pretty simple, identify sage grouse habitat on the property, map it, integrate the grazing management plan into that conservation plan. And so it's a pretty simple requirement there. These conservation measures, everybody that signed up for the CCA are already doing. Placing salt and mineral supplements in sites to minimize impacts to sage grouse habitat. Avoid placing salt or supplements within a quarter mile of riparian habitats. And fitting new and existing water troughs with escape ramps. This is a big one, avoiding or rotationally utilizing no nesting and brood rearing habitat in places that you might concentrate livestock. The majority of landowners are already implementing a rotational grazing system. Some others need to construct some fences and water development in order to actually implement their plans. So we're working with them on that. A few others came up with some other conservation measures of their own that weren't listed in the plan, such as cutting hay meadows from the pivot towards the outside of the field to allow sage grouse to disperse and eliminate mortalities. Another conservation measure is to treat or remove undesirable woodland species encroaching into sage grouse habitats. A lot of the landowners are working on this. 10 removed juniper and conifer that was encroaching into lac habitat, and Russian olive and salt cedar were treated on 2 different ranches. and consult with agency specialists to relocate, redesign, or mark existing fences that occur within 0.6 of a mile of a lek. This was a big one. 2 ranches removed over 14 miles of redundant fence, 6 marked new fences, and 1 removed 1 mile of woven wire that was within 2 miles of a lek. This is just one story I want to highlight. One of our participants had pasture rotation limitations, and his goal was to create winter water source in 5 pastures. So we've been working with him. Again, this is above and beyond. It's kind of an opportunity above and beyond the CCAA. We found him funding. I think it was about a $70,000 project, and he ended up paying about $12,000 of it. So we got quite a bit of that paid for. In addition, he put in 3 miles of pipeline, 5 water tanks, and now he has an amazing ability to rotate his livestock throughout areas that he couldn't get to otherwise. And what the Fish and Wildlife Service gets from that is the conservation of sage grouse habitat. And of course, he still has the assurances associated with that CCAA. So this is all above and beyond. Just opens up opportunities.
So looking at, how does this take the gamble out of grazing? Well, one of the things that the ranchers were really concerned with in this particular CCAA and for this particular species is that they would be able to continue their ranching operation into the future and not be asked to do any more than they currently are if that species were listed. And so for that, to have that assurance is the only way that we were able to accomplish that really is by working together to address any of those issues with Endangered Species Act concern. And so it provides insurance for success. There's no way that we would have been able to accomplish all of the things that Colleen was talking about with those successes and sign up that many individual CCAAs on their own. So by doing it with partnerships and a collaborative effort, that was really what made that work.
So as Leanne just said, it's an insurance policy. It's not a tool for everybody. It's a voluntary option. It works well for those who want to continue doing all the good things they're doing, really.
And they look at it as, the good grazing practices and we're all trying to do good grazing practices, and that looks different for different operations. So instead of saying that it has to be one particular way, is allowing that flexibility. But I'm sure you've heard the adage of what's good for the bird is good for the herd, if you've been around sage grouse stuff at all.
And it's a great way for folks to buffer the federal government regulations. It's a great voluntary tool that is available. It kind of keeps those federal regulations at bay and allows you to keep doing what you're doing.
So with that, we would entertain any questions.